Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our live coverage of the latest mission from NASA's Kennedy Space Center. I'm Will Robinson Smith. I'll be conducting our commentary for the duration of this coverage. We're broadcasting, as we always do, from right here at KSC, here on the edge of the press lawn overlooking historic Launch Complex 39A, on what is starting off as quite a beautiful morning here on Florida's Space Coast. Falcon 9 rocket launch targeting an on-time departure at this point in the morning from Pad 39A. This vehicle carrying with it 21 Starlink satellites, 13 of which have the capability to support SpaceX's growing constellation with direct-to-cell capabilities. We'll talk more about that as we continue on through the count. Want to thank our Spaceflight Now editor, Stephen Young, who's running the technical operations of the broadcast today. Our photography team also out and raring to go here as we're T-minus 59 minutes and counting before the liftoff of this Falcon 9 rocket. Anna Bernstein getting the cameras all set and prepped here at the press site. Also do some still photography as well. Other photographer Michael Kane does have this launch off, but you should still follow both of these gentlemen on their social channels if you're not already doing so, to follow the work that they capture. Adam is at Aburn NYC. Michael is at MD Kane Jr. While you're on X, formerly known as Twitter, you can find us just by searching for Spaceflight Now. If you're not on X, you can find us on Blue Sky as well as Facebook and Threads. We'll also be joined with tracking support today by our friends Pete Carsons with Max Q Productions, as well as Chuck and Jen Briggs with C&J Images, taking a live look at their camera view here. Taking a look down at 39A from the vantage point of Titusville. Also want to thank our wonderful moderator in the live chat, Callistia Lee, for joining us this morning. And a big thank you to the 860 of you watching live as we're getting things rolling today. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor just by clicking the like button, allowing the YouTube algorithm to do its thing and bring this live launch coverage to more folks as we continue on through the count. We have a wonderful channel member community that makes these live launch opportunities possible. So thanks to folks like Sulfur for Lunch, Mark McIntosh, Sloan, Solopolis, Joni Mahoney, Ray M., and many others. Bonnie Long, good morning to you. Cumulus Granatus, hello, hello. Channel membership comes with a number of perks, including discounts at our online shop, that is shop.spaceflightnow.com. Access to member-only videos here on YouTube, access to our member-only Discord, as well as the ability to watch our live liftoff moments from here at the Cape. Taking a look at the live chat briefly, do see Heather Scott in the live chat, who, if this is in fact the Heather Scott that I'm thinking of, used to be over with the media relations, first on the Cape side and then here at KSC before heading overseas and having a wonderful time, I believe, in Germany now at this point. So, Heather, if you are the Heather I'm thinking of, special shout out to you. Appreciate you being here with us in the live chat. Currently T-minus 55 minutes, 58 seconds and counting. This Falcon 9 rocket, the third for SpaceX on the year so far, having previously launched the Thuraya 4 NGS communications satellite, as well as a batch of Starlinks. This will be the fourth global launch attempt around the world, including one from China, a launch of a Long March 3B rocket with a Shijian 25 satellite. The venting you're seeing right now from the strong back typical for Pad 39A launch, part of what has been a routine here at the pad for a number of launches in mid to late 2025 up to, or 2024 up till now. That's the area where we usually see the big vent as SpaceX begins to chill the feed lines prior to second stage LOX load. That'll be a much more pronounced venting when we get to that point. No fuel or oxidizers flowing on board the Falcon 9 rocket just yet. That process set to begin here in less than 20 minutes. One last bit of housekeeping here. If you have a comment or question about this launch or other happenings going on in the realm of spaceflight, you can use the YouTube Super Chat feature. Not only will you be giving us some interesting things to talk about as we continue on through the countdown, but you'll be supporting what we do here at Spaceflight Now at the exact same time, and that is always greatly appreciated. So take a live look out here across the Space Coast in our wide view from the press lawn. You see that layer of clouds that's moving out toward the east, kind of running at a slant here. Sort of running south of the pad, best we can tell. So the 45th Weather Squadron did not indicate that cumulus clouds would be an issue for a launch when they issued their launch weather forecast. Looking at a 95% chance of favorable weather at liftoff today, so pretty idyllic conditions for the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket as we're looking again at the on-time departure of this rocket at 10:27 a.m. Eastern this morning. That's 15:27 UTC for our friends around the world joining in. As we're tracking the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from here at Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. Of course, this isn't the only launch that we're looking for before the week's end here on Florida's Space Coast. Over at Pad 36, you can see the live pictures here. Also keeping tabs on Blue Origin and the reemergence of its New Glenn rocket, getting ready to make its inaugural flight from that particular pad over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Right now, Blue is targeting a launch no earlier than 1 a.m. on Friday morning, 0600 UTC, Friday, January 10th. Blue has a 3-hour launch window on that day, and that's the first opportunity for liftoff of this rocket. As we get closer to that launch point, we'll get a better idea of the specific launch weather forecast. So we'll talk about that a little bit closer. We did see the spotlights pop on last night here at the pad, so thought perhaps Blue may be ready to roll out the rocket and bring it vertical at the pad. Obviously, as you can see, that has not happened as of yet. If you'd like to keep track of what's going on here, you can always pop over to our 24-hour live channel, that is Launchpad Live here on our YouTube channel. 24-hour live stream, I should say, to make the distinction more exact. We will also have robust live coverage of Blue's inaugural flight right here on the channel. So if you haven't already, now's a great time to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you have notifications turned on, and that way you'll be notified when we do begin live coverage as well as post new content here to our channel. Speaking of launch preparations, not only is Blue preparing for its New Glenn launch, but coming back to SpaceX, in addition to this Falcon 9 getting ready to launch now in less than 50 minutes, if all remains on track. They're also looking at another Starlink launch from here in Florida, right now targeting no earlier than also Friday morning from Pad 40. We'll see if that launch date sticks or slips. And then, of course, down in Starbase, SpaceX is preparing for Flight 7 of its Starship rocket. Booster 14 still out on its own there at Launch Tower number 1, waiting to receive the ship upper stage, which is still being worked on at the moment. If you happen to pop over to Lab Padre's feed, on their channel yesterday, our streaming partners when it comes to Starship launch missions, you may have noticed they were loading the Starlink simulators on board the ship upper stage S-33. Don't believe there's a road closure scheduled for today, so it'll be at least another day, presumably, before we see some movement on the ship upper stage. Some recent notices that were published, I believe, yesterday as well, or early today, suggesting a launch no earlier than the 13th. But of course, SpaceX themselves has not formally announced when they are targeting launch of Starship Flight 7. But you can bet we'll be down there to cover it whenever SpaceX is ready to move forward with that mission as well. And then back here, Pad 39A, we're looking towards the launch of Firefly's Blue Ghost lunar lander, lifting off at the same time as iSpace's Hakuto R mission number 2. They'll share a Falcon 9 rocket. Very different trajectories, though. We'll have much more to say on that as the days roll on and we get closer to that launch, looking to lift off no earlier than January 15th. That's the opening of a 6-day launch window for that mission. Time now, T-minus 47 minutes, 19 seconds and counting. As we are waiting for fueling to start on this Falcon 9 rocket, let's go ahead and talk about the launch countdown timeline, the nominal list of events for an on-time departure of this Falcon 9 rocket. If SpaceX is in a good position to do so, they can take the poll for the start of prop load a little bit early, but T-minus 38 minutes is nominally when that happens. When the go-ahead for fueling is given, though, it starts with 2 main events. The loading of RP-1, or a rocket-grade kerosene, on board the Falcon 9's first and second stages. At the same time, liquid oxygen begins flowing on board the Falcon 9's first stage. When we're done with this rundown, we'll punch in a little closer on the Falcon 9 rocket and let you know where we're looking at for the start of fueling, assuming that SpaceX doesn't give explicit word that fueling has begun on social media. T-minus 30 minutes is when SpaceX starts to load a cryogenic helium on board the pressure vessels for the Falcon 9's first stage. Helium is important because it's used to pressurize the main propellant tanks during flight. Same will happen on the second stage a few minutes after that. T-minus 23 minutes is when the second stage kerosene loading wraps up. And about T-minus 20 minutes and 50 seconds is when the strong back chill down process gets underway. This is when SpaceX is, as I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, is conditioning the feed lines at the pad prior to second stage LOX load. Here at Pad 39A, we start to see the visual evidence of that with the so-called big vent. Here at 39A begins about T-minus 20 minutes and 30 seconds, right around that pocket, as opposed to over at Pad 40, where we start to see it at T minus 20 minutes and 20 seconds. Either way you play it, second stage LOX load begins at about the 16-minute mark. Moving right along, T minus 7 minutes is when the chill down of the 9 Merlin engines begins. That involves flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and turbo pumps, helping to protect the engines from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. 6 minutes before launch, the first stage kerosene tank is full. Then at T minus 4.5 minutes, the strong back retract sequence gets underway. Starts with the clamp arms just beneath the payload fairings opening up, and then the transporter erector, or the strong back, reclines a few degrees away from the Falcon 9 rocket, and it stays in that position until liftoff. At that point, it'll pull back in a much more rapid fashion to clear the way for the vertical climb on the Falcon 9. 3 minutes out, the first stage liquid oxygen tank is full. Same is true on the second stage about a minute after that, at which point the vehicle is fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. In the final 60 seconds, as we hear the call that the Falcon 9 is in startup, control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground sequencer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computers, and the propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. SpaceX launch director will give their go for launch 45 seconds before liftoff. The engine ignition command is issued at T minus 3 seconds, and if all 9 Merlin engines are healthy and ignite as expected, the command will be given for the hold down clamps to release the Falcon 9 rocket for a T0 liftoff. Once again, coming up here at 10:27 a.m. Eastern, 15:27 UTC, or T minus 43 minutes and 22 seconds. T minus 42 minutes, 46 seconds and counting. As per usual with a Falcon 9 rocket, SpaceX does have a launch window available to it, assuming that fueling has not begun. If they don't give the go-ahead for a launch at 10:27, with tanking beginning 35 minutes before that, SpaceX does have backup opportunities that extend out to 2:17 p.m. Eastern. It's 1917 UTC. And if for whatever reason none of those pan out, they do have additional launch opportunities coming up on Thursday, tomorrow, January 9th, beginning at 9:59 a.m. Eastern. 14:59 UTC. Taking a look at our live chat here is for T minus 41 minutes, 12 seconds and counting. Want to welcome in Andy, joining with channel membership at the pad leader level. Really appreciate that, Andy. Welcome aboard. Glad to have you with us. Also, new channel member Andy then jumps in with a 10-pound super chat. Appreciate that support, Andy. Asking how many Starlink satellites are currently / proposed in orbit, and what is their risk to future launches? A good question. I'll answer in a couple different ways. So prior to today's launch, a total of 7,656 Starlink satellites have been launched. There have been 154 batches of the V2 mini varieties Starlink satellites launched to date. According to tracking data from Jonathan McDowell, who's an expert orbital tracker as well as astronomer. Currently in orbit, there are a little more than 6,900 Starlink satellites. More than 2,800 of those are the V2 mini variety. To the slash proposed in orbit part of your question, don't have it right in front of me, but I believe SpaceX has been granted permission from the FCC for 7,500 Starlink satellites of the V2 mini variety. As to the risk to future launches, they do have avoidance maneuverable capabilities, and satellite operators do bear responsibility to communicate with one another and try to avoid what you call a conjunction or a collision on orbit as much as is feasibly possible. And actually, SpaceX published a progress report back uh, just last month talking about some of the features of the Starlink satellites and their maneuverability. Starlink V2 minis use argon Hall effect thrusters and have ion propulsion systems that allow for their maneuverability. So broadly speaking, of course, it is optimal for all the satellite operators to avoid each other as much as feasibly possible while you have an active satellite. And then nowadays, it's becoming a increasingly common practice to either deorbit your satellite intentionally and have a plan to do so before it launches so that it burns up in the atmosphere. Or if you're in a higher orbit, you would put it into a graveyard orbit, so-called graveyard orbit, so it's out of the way for future launches and other operational satellites. So, good question. Currently, T minus 36 minutes, 53 seconds and counting. At this point, SpaceX will have made the call on the start of prop load. And if they're still targeting a launch at 10:27 a.m. Eastern, 15:27 UTC, fueling is set to begin now in just about a minute and a half. Time now, T minus 35 minutes, 11 seconds and counting. Before we go into the tight shot of the rocket to talk about the start of fueling here, which should now just be getting underway, do want to briefly address something that I saw come up in the live chat for our non-US viewers who may be unaware. The reason that the American flag there at the pole is at half staff is in out of respect for former President Jimmy Carter, who passed away at age of 100, currently lying in repose at the U.S. Capitol right now in Washington, D.C. And tomorrow, a number of government facilities will be closed in a day of remembrance. So the flags are flying at half staff right now in honor of the 39th President of the United States, who served as a humanitarian and did a lot of great work after his presidency. Coming back to the Falcon 9 rocket, currently T minus 33 minutes, 50 seconds, and counting. So take a closer look at the launch vehicle. We'll see just beneath, it's a little hard to make out, even though this is a fairly new rocket. But we're looking for, if you see where the strong back starts to taper in, near the base of the Falcon 9 rocket, you see sort of the majority of kind of the lower part of the first stage booster is sort of a charcoal gray. Then there's a slightly darker band just above that. Just above that point, you start to see a slightly lighter gradient. That's about where we expect to see a frost line start to form as the super cold densified liquid oxygen begins to flow on board that stage. And so we'll look for signs of that frost line starting to build up and some vapor in that area as well. And that'll be a good visual indication that fueling is in fact moving forward. Time now, T minus 30 minutes, 24 seconds and counting. We do feel confident that the frost line is starting to rise up the first stage booster. indicating that fueling is in fact underway, which suggests that SpaceX is locked into a T0 of 10:27 a.m. Eastern, 15:27 UTC, the opening of the window today. Because SpaceX uses that densified liquid oxygen in a so-called load and go style of fueling. Once tanking of the Falcon 9 has begun, they do not have the option to hold the count and pivot to another point in the launch window. So this locks them into that T0 I just mentioned. Also, at this point in the countdown, past the 30-minute mark, that also suggests that SpaceX is loading the cryogenic helium into the pressure vessels on the Falcon 9's first stage at this point. Time now T minus 27 minutes, 20 seconds and counting. Taking a look at the live chat, want to thank one of our moderators, Aussie Space Girl, for hopping in here with us today as well. Good to see you. Also want to thank a few folks for your support as we're now ticking down to less than 30 minutes ahead of liftoff. Thanks to channel member Chuck Close for a very generous $25 super chat. Really appreciate that, Chuck. Good to see you this late morning here on the Space Coast. Channel member Nelson Reyes has been with us now for a full year, marking 12 months as a channel member at the mission specialist level. Fabulous to see. He says T plus 12 months of membership and counting. Nelson then also gifts 5 Spaceflight Now memberships, helping to grow our community here on YouTube. Really appreciate that generosity. So to our 5 newest channel members, welcome aboard. We're glad to have you with us. Be sure to thank Nelson in the live chat if you haven't already. We hope you decide to stick around with channel membership past the month mark and well into 2025 and beyond. Lastly, Nelson with a $10 super chat. Appreciate that. Tip of the cap there, Nelson, who says, if the U.S. acquires Greenland, would a polar launch facility equate to an equatorial facility? It's an interesting question, although more than likely would be unnecessary. Number one, because the U.S. has polar launch capabilities from primarily Vandenberg, but also the Falcon 9 is capable of polar launches from here in Florida. It's been a minute since we've seen a polar launch from the Sunshine State, but it is possible. And also, we don't have to deal with the same weather that you would see in Greenland. So, more than likely, not enough advantages to justify that, but an interesting thought experiment. Just a quick bit of context for why Nelson was asking about Greenland, and I'll make this brief as it is a bit of a side tangent. There's been some talk from the incoming administration of ways to possibly acquire to potentially acquire Greenland or enter into a closer relationship. Greenland, of course, does have its own independent government, so it's not just a matter of dealing with Denmark. And we'll go ahead and leave it at that to keep things apolitical here on the channel. There are plenty of other politics shows here on YouTube that you can go to find, I'm sure, much more robust conversations about the whole Greenland debate, but we'll just stick with the space angle that Nels presented and move right along. T minus 23 minutes, 23 seconds, and counting to the liftoff of this Falcon 9 rocket. So far, all seems to be moving well and on track for an on-time departure of this launch vehicle. Time now T minus 21 minutes, 41 seconds and counting. We are just about to come up on the start of the so-called big vent. Want to briefly touch on the booster history here, and this will be quite brief since this is just the third launch of Falcon 9 first stage booster, tail number 1086 in the SpaceX fleet. Its first outing came back as a side booster, actually, for a Falcon Heavy launch of the GOES-U satellite back on June 25th. It should actually be 2024, not 2022. Slight typo there. That was followed up on December 8th by the launch of a batch of Starlink satellites. And that, of course, brings us to today, the next launch of Starlink satellites on board this Falcon 9 rocket, T minus 20 minutes, 47 seconds and counting. Again, the big vent happens earlier here at pad 39A, so should really start to see it get in full swing in about 5 seconds. There you see the big vent. We see this visually come up as SpaceX is chilling the feed lines prior to second stage liquid oxygen load. It's also a good visual indication that fueling remains on time. Now, time T minus 15 minutes, 38 seconds and counting. The big vent has wrapped up, as you can see. Just a little bit of tapering off there from the strong back. SpaceX now loading that liquid oxygen on board the Falcon 9's second stage. 10 T minus 13 minutes, 26 seconds and counting. Want to thank the more than 6,300 of you who are joining with us live as we're getting ready to see this Falcon 9 rocket lift off from Historic Launch Complex 39A. If you haven't already, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could hit that like button for us. Allows more folks to find their way into this live launch coverage in the time remaining. Also want to thank channel member Glenn A for a $2 super chat. Really appreciate that, Glenn. As we're getting ready to see the departure of the third Falcon 9 rocket of the year, let's go ahead and talk about SpaceX's workhorse vehicle, the Falcon 9. Stands at a height of 70 meters or 229 feet tall, has diameter of 3.66 meters or 12 feet. The majority of that is made up by the Falcon 9's first stage, bottom two-thirds of the rocket. As we mentioned, with this particular booster, it has flown twice before, looking for its third launch today. Tail number 1086 in the SpaceX fleet. At the base, the first stage are 9 Merlin engines, which burn a rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen, producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Around the engine compartment are black carbon fiber landing legs that will be used to land the first stage on the drone ship. Today, SpaceX is using the drone ship called a shortfall of gravitas. Above the first stage is the inner stage. This is a composite structure consisting of an aluminum honeycomb core, which is surrounded by carbon fiber. In the image on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the deployable hypersonic grid fins. These are titanium winglets that provide stability and steering for the Falcon 9 as it comes back through the atmosphere, tail first like a big old dart towards the drone ship. At the top of the inner stage are 3 mechanical latches that attach to the second stage. And that first stage main engine cutoff, high-pressure helium is used to release those latches, and 4 pneumatic pushers ensure clean separation. Also, the second stage engine nozzle is safely housed inside the interstage adapter until stage separation. Speaking of the second stage, the upper stage of the Falcon 9, powered by a single modified Merlin engine called a Merlin vacuum engine, or an MVAC engine. It's equipped with a large nozzle which is optimized for burns in the vacuum of space, hence the name. It produces more than 220,500 pounds of thrust and will be fired twice on today's flight, placing the 21 Starlink satellites into their intended orbit. Same as the first stage, the upper stage of the Falcon 9 also burns RP-1 and LOX. Following deployment of the Starlink satellites, a little more than an hour and 5 minutes after a liftoff, the upper stage will perform a brief deorbit burn, helping to drive the upper stage back into the atmosphere where it will burn up, helping to eliminate the risk of creating any unnecessary space debris on this mission. Finally, at the top of the Falcon 9 stack are the payload fairings, which encapsulate the 21 Starlink satellites. The fairings are made up of a carbon composite material, which is 13.1 meters or 43 feet tall, 5.2 meters or 17.1 feet in diameter. The fairing halves will be recovered a little further downrange from where the first stage lands on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas. They gently splash down under the support of parachutes. SpaceX will then recover the fairing halves, bring them back into port, where they will be refurbished and plan to be turned around for future use. SpaceX is working to certify both its first stage boosters as well as its payload fairings for up to 40 flights each. believe the last count that SpaceX publicized about its payload fairings is that they had notched up to 22 flights, I believe, in total. The most flown first stage booster remains B-1067, which launched at the beginning of December most recently on its 24th launch and landing. Time now T minus 8 minutes and counting. We're just about a minute away from the chill down of the 9 Merlin engines at the base of the Falcon 9 rocket, where they will flow a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and turbo pumps, helping to protect them from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. Time now T minus 6 minutes, 19 seconds and counting. At this point, SpaceX is just about done fueling or loading RP-1 on board the Falcon 9's first stage. That should be wrapping up here in the next few seconds. As we're now within the last 6 minutes of the count, and we've got now a little more than 10,000 of you joining with us live. Let's go ahead and talk about where this Falcon 9 rocket will be flying once it leaves the pad. Let's talk a little trajectory, shall we? Before we peek over there, notice a few folks are starting to gather on the press line. It's been a minute since we've had a string of daylight Falcon launches. Obviously, a nice opportunity for folks to pop away from work and enjoy a liftoff from here at the Kennedy Space Center before heading back to their normal day jobs. Once this Falcon 9 does clear the pad, it will be flying in a southeasterly trajectory heading away from Launch Complex 39A here at, as NASA would say, world's premier spaceport. Falcon 9 rocket will follow that green arc. First stage booster, though, will break off and follow that red path you see there and set up a landing on the drone ship called a short fall of gravitas. Positioned in the Atlantic Ocean. If successful, this will be the 93rd booster landing for that particular drone ship and the 393rd booster landing to date. SpaceX is also aiming to recover the payload fairings, as we mentioned, which splashed down under the support of parachutes, put on a recovery vessel, and will be brought back into port.
Strong back retract sequence has started.
As you just heard, the strong back retract getting underway, getting some pad level views and mission audio from SpaceX. As you may recall, they seem to be having some audio issues during Monday's launch, which is why we weren't able to bring you mission audio then, but we thankfully are getting it today. So we will do our level best to not talk over the callouts as they happen. As you can see, though, the clamp arms beneath the payload fairings have opened up, and the strong back will pull away a few degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket, stay in that position until liftoff. Also, just a quick bit of housekeeping here. You'll notice the clock in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, different than what you're seeing from the SpaceX feed currently in the big box. Reason for that is our clock is in real time. What's coming in from SpaceX is on a slight delay, so we'll be making our callouts based on the real-time clock as long as we have ground-level views of the Falcon 9 rocket.
Stage 1 lock float is complete.
Good call from SpaceX. We are now just awaiting a similar call for the Falcon 9's second stage, the conclusion of second stage liquid oxygen loading. At that point, the Falcon 9 rocket will be fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. They should be ticking that fueling box here right about now. Less than 30 seconds, we'll see some additional venting from the strong back. Those are the ground gas closeouts starting here in about 20-ish seconds. There you see ground gas closeouts now underway. As you just heard, stage 2 lock load is complete. Again, the SpaceX feed and the callouts from there coming in on a slight delay. So that's why you're hearing a little bit of discrepancy.
Gas closeouts.
With that call, we're just about a minute away from the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket, SpaceX's third orbital flight of the year. We'll come back to the live chat on the other side of liftoff, but for now, we'll focus on the vehicle as we're T-minus 1 minute and counting. In the next several seconds, we should be hearing a call that the Falcon 9 is in startup.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Good call. Now just awaiting the SpaceX launch director to give their go for launch. Standing by for that in just a few seconds.
Launch director, go for launch.
And with that, we are now less than 30 seconds away in real time from the liftoff of this Falcon 9 rocket, carrying on board 21 Starlink satellites, lifting off in 18 seconds. And here we go. In 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket on the Starlink 12-11 flight. Falcon 9 has cleared the tower. Falcon 9 about a minute plus into flight. SpaceX will soon be throttling down the engines as it approaches max Q at the point of greatest aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. Some great work by our tracking team today. Good call for Max Q. SpaceX will, in the next several seconds, begin thermal conditioning and the chill down of the Merlin vacuum engine. That'll prepare them for a few events in fairly rapid succession. We'll see first stage main engine cutoff, or MECO, about T plus 2 minutes and 26 seconds. That'll be followed by stage separation, the ignition of that Merlin vacuum engine, and then fairing deployment just after the 3-minute mark. Coming up on MECO here in real time. Unfortunately, the rocket has gone into the cloud, so it's hard to see from our tracking cameras, but we should hear the call up from SpaceX momentarily.
Main engine cutoff.
Stage separation confirmed.
And back ignition.
All good calls from SpaceX. Here in real time, we're about 6 seconds from payload fairing deployment. Our cameras are still scanning the skies to see if we can reacquire a visual on that. See the hypersonic grid fins deploying on the Falcon 9's first stage there in the box on the left-hand side of your screen.
Fairing separation confirmed.
Good call, good visuals. Those 21 Starlink satellites now exposed to the vacuum of space for the first time on this mission. You can see one of those fairing halves just off the side of the engine nozzle from this camera vantage point. Once again, these fairing halves will splash down in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean under the support of parachutes. And a recovery vessel will scoop them up and bring them back into port for refurbishment and reuse. Now 4 minutes into flight in real time. You could see the cloud layer beneath both the upper stage and the booster. What that means for us on the ground is it's not a very easy tracking day, so unfortunately we probably won't be able to reacquire ground level tracking of the Falcon 9 rocket, though we are still scanning the skies for that. If we are able to see it again, we'll be sure to bring those pictures to you. The next the next post liftoff milestone that we're looking for here is the start of the first stage entry burn. Lasting about 25 seconds in duration, SpaceX will ignite 3 of the Merlin engines at the base of the Falcon 9 first stage, helping to slow the vehicle down dramatically as it continues to make its way towards the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas. Now 5 minutes into flight in real time. Those bursts you're seeing on the booster, those are the cold gas thrusters helping the first stage booster B1086 adjust its attitude or its positioning. This now look up through the inner stage at the top of the first stage booster. Now coming up on T plus 6 minutes.
Stage 1 FTS has safed.
And counting.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
Good call for the start of entry burn. See that visual there on the left-hand side of your screen. You also heard the call that the Stage 1 FTS or Flight Termination System has been safed. It is no longer needed at this point in the flight.
Stage 1 entry burn start down.
With the conclusion of that entry burn, we are now waiting the start of the first stage landing burn. That should start around
Stage 2
T
FTS has safed.
plus 7 minutes and 43 seconds, allowing for a safe touchdown on the drone ship.
Stage 1 transonic. Stage 1 landing burn.
Good call for the start of landing burn. We should see drone ship level views coming up on the right-hand side of your screen momentarily.
Stage 2 terminal guidance.
Stage 1 landing leg deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And against a beautiful, just lightly cloudy sky, a good touchdown of B-1086 on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas.
Impact shutdown.
Nominal orbit insertion.
Good call-outs from SpaceX, the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket now entering into that parking orbit where it will remain in that coast phase till about T plus 53 minutes and 57 seconds. There will then be a brief 2-second burn to help circularize the orbit. Then the Starlink satellites will be deployed at T plus 1 hour, 5 minutes, and 6 seconds. SpaceX will issue confirmation of that through its social channels. Before we get to our mission stats that currently stand, I want to thank a few more folks for their support during this live coverage. Michael McLeod with a very generous $20 super chat, one of our channel members, saying, really appreciate you guys. Thank you. Well, thank you, Michael, for your support, especially at that level. Andy, back with another 10-pound super chat. Appreciate you, Andy. He says, question for everyone. You're given the chance to do a low orbit space flight lasting 5 minutes. You're allowed to play one piece of music during that flight. What song would you choose? I'll let the live chat muse on that as we continue on. Jamie Walton with a $2 super chat asking which pieces of the rocket are not reused. Those would be the upper stage for the Falcon 9 rocket in particular. So SpaceX uses a brand new upper stage every time they have a Falcon 9 launch, which will give you an idea of their rate of manufacturing and production for the second stages, how much they need to crank out to support launches roughly every 2.5 days on average these days. And thanks to Space Q for a $5 super chat. And Infinity with a €2 super chat. Sounded like his are there getting ready for lunchtime, hankering for some noodles. Speaking of hankering, hungry for some mission stats, so let's go ahead and turn to that now as we begin to close out our live coverage here of the Starlink 12-11 mission. With a good liftoff and landing of the first stage booster, that marked flight number 3 for B-1086. This was SpaceX's 420th Falcon 9 launch to date, the third of 2025 so far. This was SpaceX's 364th Falcon booster reflight, with the launch of a booster that has flown at least once. There will be a little repetitiveness with some of the stats here as we're still very early on in the year, but of course this was SpaceX's third orbital launch of 2025 as well. All of them so far from Florida, though they are gearing up for, as early as tomorrow, launch for the National Reconnaissance Office from out of Vandenberg. This was the 99th orbital launch for SpaceX from Pad 39A and the 193rd overall orbital launch from this pad. It's just a point of note, if there's not another launch in between this one and the mission launching Firefly's Blue Ghost lunar lander and iSpace's Hakuto R Mission 2 lander, that flight, bound for the moon with those two companies, will be SpaceX's 100th orbital launch from Pad 39A. Here's where the bar chart now stands, taking a look from SpaceX's launch history up to the present day. Moving on to some recovery stats. This was the 93rd booster landing successfully on the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. That marked the 313th drone ship landing for SpaceX and the 393rd overall booster landing to date. Finally, with some industry stats on the year, this very young year so far, this was the third orbital launch from Florida, the third orbital launch from U.S. soil, the third from U.S. Rocket Company, and the fourth orbital launch attempt from around the world, including a Long March 3B mission from China. Fortunately, no launch failures so far. Here's where the pie chart now stands. U.S. stands at 3, China at 1. Everyone else looking to get on the board as the year goes on. And as our day goes on, we're going to go ahead and bid you all adieu. I want to thank our friends Pete Carstens with Max Q Productions, Chuck and Jen Briggs with C&J Images for their support in tracking this Falcon 9 rocket. Once again, just as a reminder, you can always head over to our website, spaceflightnow.com, click on the launch schedule tab at the top of the page, and you can get an idea of all the launches that are coming up here, orbital launches, I should specify. Also, looking towards Blue Origin's New Glenn inaugural flight coming up here at the end of the week. First chance for launch, Friday, January 10th, 1 a.m. Eastern, 0600 UTC. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, ring that bell, do all the things, and you will ensure that you won't miss the start of our live launch coverage with that mission. I see the strong back coming up here at the pad, as I want to thank our photographer, Adam Bernstein, being out here to track the rocket as well as do some still photography. You can follow him on X, Apron NYC. Michael Kane, our other photographer, at MD Kane Jr. I want to thank our Spaceflight Now editor, Stephen Young, for running the technical operations of the broadcast. Thanks to our moderators in the live chat, Aussie Space Girl, Callisti Lee, for holding it down. Starting to get kind of late there in Australia, so we'll go ahead and let Aussie Space Girl head on out the digital door. Get the last word to Charles Baxter with a $10 super chat saying thank you, Spaceflight Now. And I'll put that thank you right back to you for wherever you are watching this live launch from, you dear viewer. We appreciate you being with us for a live launch coverage, and we're very excited to do it all over again with you in the very near future. For all of us here at Spaceflight Now, I'm Will Robinson Smith. Remember, be good to yourselves, be good to others, and we will see you next time, folks. And until then, bye-bye.